Hey guys, welcome to the channel. I'm super excited today because today I've got for you as a guest Dhaval Patel. Now, for many of you, Dhaval may not need an introduction, but here's one anyway. Dhaval is a very senior engineer. He's had over a decade and a half of experience, close to 2 decades actually, as a software engineer, and then he transformed his career and expanded his skill set to include data engineering, so machine learning and data science and all that goes with it. Now he currently works at Bloomberg, which is one of the largest fintechs in the world, and he's in their data engineering space. And before that, he was in NVIDIA, so a very accomplished engineer at some of the most world-renowned brands. But let me tell you something else about Dhaval. I consider Dhaval to be a friend now, and he's got one of the biggest hearts I've ever seen in a human being. He is truly an extraordinary and special human being. And not only is he an excellent engineer, he's a born giver and a teacher. So much so that his YouTube channel, and you have to check it out because I'll link it in the description below, but his YouTube channel has now amassed more than 500,000 subscribers, which is quite extraordinary. Because Dhaval is not someone who grew up in the lap of luxury. He lives a very good life in the US now and is an extremely successful and respected engineer, but he had modest beginnings from a relatively rural part of India. Now, he didn't come from a family with a lot of wealth, for example, but between his family and him, they made a lot of sacrifices. And this is the one thing I really want you to take away from this conversation with Dhaval today, because he will go into some of these things during the conversation. But just remember that all of us have excuses. All of us feel like we have particularly difficult situations and circumstances. Please, please, please listen to everything that Dhaval is saying, because all the excuses that we have, they seem very real to us, and they are real. They're valid, right? But they're not reasons unless we let them become our reasons, unless we let them stop us. Now, take Dhaval's example and see how, even though he had many excuses that he could have used and his circumstances that could have held him back, neither him nor his family allowed the excuses to become reasons to be held back. And I want you, whoever you are, wherever you are, to really, really take this on board. No matter where you are in your life, no matter how fortunate or unfortunate your circumstances may be, you will always feel like your excuses are serious. Your excuses are real reasons. They're not. They're valid excuses, but they're not valid reasons. Okay? So please spend some time really taking that message on board. And also enjoy learning about his journey, because, it's almost 2 decades and the world has changed a lot since, 2001, 2002 when he started out, which was around the same time that I started out in my career, but I was a lawyer, so a very different world. But I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you because I think he's a special human being. His journey is extraordinary. So check out his YouTube channel because it's got some phenomenal resources for learning to code, programming, concepts of data science and machine learning. Very, very accessible. Unlike a lot of other channels out there and a lot of other material out there, Dhaval goes through extraordinary lengths to make it digestible and simple and easy to access for you, easy to comprehend, making it first principle based explanation. So check out all his YouTube playlists, and I'll see you in the chat. Hello there, welcome to my channel. Listen, after more than 12 years as a lawyer, at the age of 37, I finally taught myself to code. Man, it wasn't easy. A year or so later, I ended up joining a startup as an engineer. And a year after that, I joined Google as an engineer. So listen, if you want to transition your career into tech, or you want to become your own technical co-founder, subscribe to my channel. Okay, Dhaval, so thanks so much for joining us. Really excited to have this conversation. You are a leading light in the community of engineers and developers, and your educational style and message is loved the world over. So I thought, we should take this opportunity to let people know a little bit more about who you are and what your story is. So, let's just dive into it, right? First question is, how did you even enter the world of computer science, and what was computer science and programming like as a career back in those days? Because I think you've had a career now for almost 2 decades, right?
Yes, I'm old. I started my career.
So am
I. Yes, so I started studying computer science in 1999, a year before the dot-com burst. I graduated in 2003. Yes, interesting times. I see a smile on your face. 2003, I started working as a computer engineer immediately after my BTech. And at that time, the world was very different. There were no mobile apps, no cloud, no data analytics, nothing. It was a world of simple three-tier application development. People were building internet. So internet boom had just begun. So there were very basic websites that different businesses were building, and it was a very an early era of IT revolution. And during that time, it was thought that there will be a lot of future demand of computer engineers, and that was the reason, I enrolled into this 4-year BTech program, become a software engineer, started building an application for handheld device. So iPhone came out in 2007, but in 2003, there were this handheld devices which were custom made, and you had to build an application on that. And I was doing that on Visual C++. The process was very kind of tiresome. When I look at the mobile application world today, like the kind of applications you can build so fast in frameworks such as React Native, the same thing would take you 10x time back in those days.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, it was a different era in many senses, right? Because that was still Web 1.0, around 2003 was still, JavaScript was just about starting to be used in the browser. It was a completely, as I remember, because I wasn't programming back then, right? I've only been programming about 2.5 years now. But from everything I've read, it was such a vastly different world. And so, two questions that flow on from that for you are, one is, did you have a computer at home growing up in India? Because I grew up in India as well. And I only got my first computer, I think, in year 12. Just before I went to college. I remember Pentium 133. I was so excited. Did you have a computer growing up at home?
No, growing up at home, I did not have a computer. But after I enrolled into this 4-year BTech program, which was my, engineering like curriculum, everyone in the class were buying computer. My father was a teacher at that time. I think buying computers was a luxury. Nowadays you have like 5 different devices at home. But at that time, buying computer was like a luxury. It was very expensive. And for my father, like it was very difficult to afford that computer. So he took a loan, and he still managed to get me a computer when I was, I think, 6 months into my computer science program. So yeah, after coming to college, after I started studying computer science, 6 or 8 months later, I got this computer which was bought on a loan. And it was, I still remember, in all my neighbors, everyone came to my home to see like what this looks like. It was like a big CRT, the CRT monitors. It was very bulky computer. And there was still the floppy disk, and the RAM was what, 512 megabyte or 256 megabyte. It was like super low. I mean, something you can't even imagine today.
Yeah, probably running Windows 98, I think, at that point in time it would have been.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember those days. And that's quite extraordinary, because, I mean, for your father to take out a loan, that's an expression of that commitment, his commitment, your family's commitment, but also an expression of your commitment that, that was the, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is, so many people today take for granted the phones you get on your mobile plan, you throw it out after 2 years, you get this, you throw it out. Like, we've gotten to a point where we've forgotten what it's like to actually take a financial commitment to pursue your dream. And we were talking about this just before we started, this session is about how people who don't spend a little bit of money on their dream have lower levels of commitment. Now it may not be possible for people, and you could argue that your father could have said it's not possible, but he took a loan, which is the ultimate expression of commitment with risk and interest.
Yes.
It doesn't get harder than that when you think about it. So, hats off to your dad and to you for, having that level of commitment. And so the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, I've often wondered this because I started teaching myself to program. I failed 3 or 4 times and then finally succeeded in 2018. And I remember thinking, gosh, this is hard, right? Learning to program is hard, but thank God for Google, because it is this is before I joined Google. So I was thinking it's so easy to search anything. Thank God for Stack Overflow. Thank God for all these things that you can, when you get stuck, you can search. How was it in 99, 2000, 2001? Google wasn't mainstream yet. Like, it was quite respected, but it wasn't as mainstream. The web didn't have as much content as it does now. How did you learn in an environment where information isn't as freely available as we take for granted now?
At that time, it was pretty much reading books and attending classes and practicing on it on your own, and taking help from your friends. Today, if you're learning coding, you are privileged because you have so much resources available, and that too for free. At that time, as you said, Google wasn't mainstream. There was no Stack Overflow. There was no Discord channels, no Udemy. Forget any of those things were not there. And I remember I started with Pascal programming. People don't even remember there is a programming language called Pascal. And my teacher at that point, she wrote a program on a board, on a whiteboard. She would just write a program, and the program was to exchange two the values, swapping, swap the values. And when you learn programming for the first time, that whole paradigm is kind of new to you. So I was like, why do you need to use a temporary variable? Can't you just say A is equal to B and B is equal to A? It was that kind of paradigm shift that I had to go through. That no, once you assign a value to a variable, it's overwritten. It cannot remember the previous state. So just going through that computer architecture, the transistor, the memory, how memory is stored, bits and bytes. It was, to be honest, quite difficult actually. And once you go through that paradigm shift, and once you are established in that new paradigm, then things started becoming little easier. It's like almost like you have studied Newton and physics, and now you want to study theory of relativity. That's a huge paradigm shift. And it takes massive. Takes a lot of time to get adjusted to that new paradigm, because you have to kind of adjust all your neurons in your brain to kind of that new way of thinking.
And I could totally relate to that, because and people tend to assume that it's because they're not smart, or there's this mythology around learning to code, which is only for super smart people, super mathematical people. You have to be some sort of crazy genius nerd, right? And it's not that. It's exactly what you said, Dhaval. It's shifting mental models to something you've never constructed in your head before. It's just a different way of thinking about the world. And I think that's something that I think a lot of people who learn to program don't fully emphasize. They're in such a hurry to say, I've learned Python, or I learned Java or JavaScript, without realizing that half the battle is to understand why it's done that way. Why does this need to be done this way? It's not enough to just know that this is what you do. You can do it by rote that way, but understanding why variable reassignment is important in a swapping function, what happens to the old one, pretty much dissipates, gets overwritten, like you said. So that's a really great example. And it's amazing that to think, I really wonder if it wasn't for the internet, would it have been much easier for me? Like, I had a little bit of help here and there, but, I remember reading the book by Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, where, he talks about he helped Bill Gates learn a lot because he was a senior in school. And he and Bill Gates had the summer job at some water plant or something, not far from where they lived. And all night they would sit and read the, I think it was the instruction manual for, the processes that were in the computers that they were using to understand how to program it. And I was thinking, they probably did this for days and days to write 3 lines of code. So, speaking of how different things are now, what would you say, Dhaval, to how has the software industry changed in the last 20 years, and how has recruitment for software engineers changed from your first job 2003 2004 to, I know you've been at first Nvidia and then Bloomberg for quite a while, but you'd be recruiting people a lot. How has the industry changed, and how has recruitment changed in the last 20 years?
So industry, of course, has gone through a big change, and that curve of change is almost exponential, because as the day goes by, the rate of change is increasing actually. And same thing applies to the industry change and a recruitment change. I have seen huge difference in the way people were recruiting people 2 years back and after 2 years, after the whole pandemic situation. I've seen people coming up with a lot of innovative way of recruiting. For example, my friend interviewed at Facebook, and they give you the mock interview. They record a video, they give you the mock interview video link saying that we want you to succeed in the interview, and we will do our best to prepare you. So the employer who's interviewing you, they will put a lot of effort in preparing you for the interview. This wasn't there before. When I was interviewing, like back in days when I was applying for a job, the interviewer will make sure that you fail. That whole mindset was they want to trick you with questions. Screening. Yeah, they will give you hard time. Now we live in a different world. They want to help you. They want to recruit you, because there's so much revolution happening in the IT industry overall. Facebook is going to hire 10,000 people just for metaverse project. Quantum computing is making a huge advancement. So if quantum computing becomes a reality, you will see pretty much all the code that is written in the world that will have to rewrite all that code, because now we are talking about another paradigm shift where we are not talking about bits like 1 and 0, like we are talking about this into quantum state qubits, right? That's a humongous change. And then talking about metaverse, the way we interact with computers, the way we connect with people on internet, that will also change. Right now you just interact with your keyboard, your mouse. Now they're talking about incorporating your natural hand movements. The way we interact with devices today is very, very primitive. It's like almost you're typing on a keyboard, you're giving computer command using a mouse. Let's say if I want to interact with other human being, like let's say I want to interact with you, it's so easy for me. I can talk. If we are meeting in person, we can use our gesture, our hand movements, and so on. You can't do that with computers. And I think that is going to change with Elon Musk coming up with this Neuralink startup. They are coming up with the devices where you can hook up the device, it can read your brain, and it can accept a command. I believe like that rate of the rate of change is just speeding up day by day, and it offers a lot of unique opportunities to people who are learning programming, who wants to build a career in IT. So going back to your question, back in days, the interviewing process was you go to an interview, they ask you to write some code not on a pen. I remember like my first interview, they did not even ask me to write code. They just had a very casual conversation and I got a job. And but overall interviewing process at that time was they will give you a hard time. I mean, I got lucky in this one interview which I had, but otherwise they will ask you like tricky question, and the question that were asked back in days was more about how good you can memorize things. Nowadays we live in a world of hacker rank where there is a screen sharing and you write code, the interviewer will ask you to, you'll be talking about that code. There are competitive programming platforms available. So there is a huge change in interviewing, and as well as the industry overall.
Right. And so, it's interesting because I'm listening to you speak and I'm thinking I wasn't around in the 70s, and, neither were you, I don't think. But, I read so much about what happened when Steve Jobs went to the Xerox Spark facility and saw the GUI for the first time, the graphical user interface, right? Which had been there for a while. And I'm starting to think, now that I understand more about operating systems and, how, the shell works, I'm like, I can now understand why the graphical user interface was this completely mind expanding, consciousness expanding experience of the computer. Like it was like in your words, a paradigm shift in how you interact with the computer, point and click with a mouse and so on. And to your point about interacting with the computers going forward, I think this multimodal way of computing, is probably similar to, whether it's through voice, gesture, recognition of, movements and so on and so forth, or Neuralink. It would be orders of magnitude of more of a jump than the jump was from command line terminal, to GUIs. It's a whole. It just makes it accessible in different environments. In the way you interact with them. That's just mind-blowing, because what that means to me, and I'd love to know your perspective on this, is the kinds of opportunities that people with coding backgrounds or knowledge of coding, you don't even necessarily have to have a background, but the kind of opportunities that are going to be available just in the next decade are things that we've never seen before. Just like I was actually looking at some roles at Google the other day that, that were on the interior board, and just looking at people's titles. And I'm like, I don't even think these titles existed 12 years ago. Like a lot of these things are just completely new.
Yes.
And so it's an enormous opportunity. Like, you don't have to be a software engineer. You don't have to just be a data scientist, but learning to code would give you access to literally, as I could count, dozens of job opportunities and career paths. Do you see that happening in the next 10 years as well?
Totally. When I grew up as a child, if you know English, you will have a unique advantage. So how knowing English would give you that unique advantage, I think same thing will happen with coding. And that's why you see so many kids learning coding nowadays. If you know coding, doesn't matter. You can be a mechanical engineer or an HR person. You will have the same advantage that you would have if you knew this one extra language, which is perceived to be a global language.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great way to think about it. Yeah, I agree. In 80s India, knowing English was a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Even if your job did not require advanced knowledge of English, you didn't have to be like, a literature major or something. Just knowing English may give you an advantage. So that's a great analogy to draw.